Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on supporting student attendance and engagement during hybrid or remote learning. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Connecticut State Department of Education, the State Department of Children and Families, and our friends at Attendance Works. My name is Matt Falconer, and I work in the Communications Office at the Department of Education. We know there's a huge amount of interest in this topic. We have nearly 650 people registered for today's session. We have a great presentation for you today. So just a few housekeeping items before we get started. All attendees are on mute. If you have a question, we ask that you please enter it in the question box in your GoToMeeting or GoToWebinar control panel. And we have some time saved at the end of today's webinar, and we'll get to as many of your questions as possible. Also want to let everyone know that today's session is being recorded, and it will be posted to our website on the webinar section of the COVID-19 page. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Deputy Commissioner Charlene Russell-Tucker. Take it away, Charlene.
Thank you so very much, Matt, and welcome all. It's great to have you here with us today. And as Matt mentioned, just based on the sheer numbers of folks who signed up, we recognize this is a topic of great importance. So we're glad that you're here with us. We have our lead presenters today. You see the beautiful pictures on the hearing from our Commissioner, Dr. Miguel Cardona. You'll be hearing from Commissioner Dorantes from the Department of Children and Families. And you'll be hearing from Hedy Chang, Executive Director at Attendance Works. Also on the panel, you'll see other members who are support to the lead presenters. We have Deputy Commissioner Michael Williams from DCF, as well as Caroline Director Lisa Diamandi. And you also, from the Department of Education, have John Frasinelli, who will be fielding your questions, Division Director. We also have Division Director Brian Klinkowitz from Special Education, also to answer questions as we need to. And we also have our Chief Performance Officer, Ajit Gopalakrishnan, who you'll be hearing from as well. And you will meet very shortly Corey Sullivan, who is, we lovingly call her boots on the ground here on attendance issues at the Department of Education. So we have a great lineup for you today. There'll be sufficient time for all the presenters and answering all your many questions. So with that, I will be silent and turn this over to Commissioner Cardona. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlene. I appreciate that introduction, and thank you to everyone on the team. You know, we're all in this together, the panelists and everyone who has information to share today. You know, I'm really thrilled to also be co-presenting with Commissioner Vannessa Dorantes and Hedy Chang. You know, I'm really just a warm-up act because there's so much great information that's going to be shared. Commissioner, you're a fantastic partner. I really enjoy working with you and the passion that you have for the students we serve together. And Hedy, you're a national expert. We're blessed to have you here joining us in Connecticut. Thank you. And for those of you that work closely with us on attendance work in Connecticut, you know that, you know, our success is due in large part to the partnership that we've had with Attendance Works and the leadership of Hedy Chang, and just fortunate to be able to co-present with you. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for everything that you're doing, not only in Connecticut, but across the country. So I look forward to a great conversation, wonderful questions, and to the hundreds of folks that are on with us, thank you for what you're doing, not only to learn more about attendance, but really everything that you're doing to protect and preserve public education in the state of Connecticut. You've done amazing work. You inspire all of us, and we want to be here to support you. So thank you. Next slide, please. I don't have to tell you the unique challenges that we have here in the state of Connecticut. Not only our students, our families, our schools, and our community providers, our partners who work alongside with us to make sure that our learners are getting the best experience, not only in school, but outside of the school, in the community. We've been tested, and I believe we're going to continue to be tested. So measuring student engagement and student attendance has been a challenge, but it's a challenge that I think the closer we work together, the better we're gonna do together. I want to acknowledge the work that you've done to this point, and recognize that we've all been thrust into this requirement of doing things a little bit differently than we're used to. And I ask us to collectively look at the silver lining to see how we can be better in public education at the end of this than where we were when we started this. I want to acknowledge we have superintendents, teachers, community partners, important support staff. I want to give a special shout out to family school liaison, my wife, who's listening in on the call, and in her work as a family school liaison. I know I have my own personal fact checker, and I'll be hearing how I did later. So I'm glad she's on the call. I'm glad all of you are on the call. Thank you. Next slide, please. You know, we know while whatever challenges come to us, we can't control those. We know that there is a recipe for success in problem solving. We know that if we continue with these key practices, we're going to get as far as we can together. You know, working together, making sure that there are structures in place where ongoing conversation happens. Noticing early, we know that when students are disengaged or they're not coming in, and it's a pattern that they've already established, it's going to be harder to break that pattern. So getting to that early, tracking and monitoring absenteeism data. I know many of you districts do an exceptional job with this. You're breaking down data by free or reduced lunch status. You're breaking down attendance data by ethnicity. You're unapologetically bringing those data up and saying, how do we solve these problems? I know you're doing that. My question is, how do we, in the time of COVID, use those data to really move our actions and move our energy toward bringing in those students that we've lost or we've disengaged in ways now that we've had to move to hybrid or remote learning. I think it's critically important that we identify successful practices. You know, oftentimes in Connecticut, we know that there are 169 or 200 municipalities working on the same problem separately. How do we do a better job learning from one another and sharing best practices? And how are you connecting the work that we're talking about to your overall goals of equity and access for all students in the state of Connecticut? These are questions that I want us to continue to think about, not only during the webinar, but when you unplug and you think about what impact you could have in your community. Next slide, please. And then, you know, I guess my ask of you, and I'm going to borrow Simon Sinek's work here on the why, right? You know, I left a meeting with about 30 superintendents about half an hour ago, and they were talking about some of the work, the challenges that they have, and they were really optimistic about working together to try to problem solve. And I think sometimes we get caught up in the what we have to do, right? Yes, we have to come up with new systems for attendance. Yes, we have to figure out how we're going to assess whether or not students are engaged from home, or if they're engaged when they're home during a hybrid model. That's hard work. That's something that we've never had to do. How are we going to do that, right? And sometimes we get caught up in the how, and you know, we're stuck on a plan, and we tend not to focus as much as we should on why. Why are we doing this? Why are we having these conversations? You're going to hear from Commissioner and from Hedy. The why is going to be really embedded in their work, in their communication, and in their slides. I had an opportunity to view their slides, and let us not lose sight of the fact why we're doing what we're doing, why the what is worth it, why the how is worth trying to figure it out. We have students in Connecticut, although I'm very proud that our percentage of students that have gone back to school is probably higher than most other states in the country. And on average, any week we have over 360,000 students walking into a schoolhouse. I know that there are many students who have disengaged or are disengaged, or we're not able to engage them. So we have a lot of work to do ahead of us to make sure that we're closing achievement disparities in Connecticut and addressing disengagement in a way that supports our learners, supports their families, and helps build a community. That's our why. That's our collective why. So let's not get distracted or discouraged by the difficult what we have to do and how we're going to do it. Let's continue to stay focused and connected on our why. And I think if we could do that, Connecticut, we're going to get out stronger than we were before the pandemic. Next slide, please. So today you're going to hear from Commissioner Vannessa Dorantes next on a trauma-informed approach. to student safety and well-being during remote and hybrid learning. I'm not gonna say the line, but in one of her first slides, I love how it's framed differently. So Vannessa, that's brilliant. So I'm going to stick with that, and you'll see what I'm talking about in the next couple slides. But how we frame this is going to matter so much because it's going to determine how we move forward together. And then we're going to hear from Hedy Chang and Deputy Commissioner Russell Tucker, who I have to say, Deputy Commissioner Russell Tucker and the team have really done exceptional work, really bringing Connecticut to a level where other states are looking at what we're doing. Long before I became Commissioner of Education, so I'm proud of their work. So Hedy and Charlene are going to be discussing how to use attendance data to guide action, identifying strategies and analysis of data. And then Chief Performance Officer Ajit Gopalakrishnan is also going to be here. Now he's really going to get into the what, right? So he's the expert in the data collection, how we do it. But throughout each of these, I'm going to ask you to remain focused on the why, so that when we hang up with this call, we're energized and ready to move forward and problem solve together. With that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to my colleague, Commissioner Vannessa Dorantes.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Cardona. And what he didn't tell you is 30 minutes before that call that he had with the other superintendents, he was in one of our meetings of collaboration. So this is not just a webinar conversation and pretend to like each other online. We are in this together, and this is not a one state agency over another. The complement to what everything Commissioner Cardona just said will be heard in the next couple of minutes that I have with you. So thank you, Commissioner Cardona. Next slide. So, one of the things that we ask you to think about as we step through this conversation this afternoon is you often hear DCF viewed through the child protective lens. And we challenge you today to listen to this through the lens of a mandated supporter. Oftentimes when you hear DCF discuss things, it's in the realm of mandated reporting or failure to report. But today we're going to talk about the other aspect of our statutory obligation. DCF is not only the child protection agency for Connecticut, but we are also children's behavioral health for all children. And so what you'll hear today is how we can encourage children to be lifetime learners in the context of the child well-being. And so we thank Commissioner Cardona for his partnership and for the invitation to talk about that here today. And then we, of course, thank his deputies and all the members of Connecticut State Department of Education and the local superintendents across the state who partner with DCF every day. Next slide. I'd also like to thank our superintendent of Unified School District 2, Matt Boland, who's on, and he is the superintendent for DCF, and he's also a dedicated partner in this work. So, one of the things that we are all very cognizant of right now is this imperfect storm that we find ourselves in. The ravages of COVID-19, the racial unrest across the country, and the economic crisis that has just devastated communities. And in the middle of all of that are the kids that we serve. And so as we try to figure out ourselves and try to figure out what's around the next corner, we understand that they are navigating this imperfect storm at the same time. Next slide, please. So it's important that as we think about how we are navigating this and how children are viewing all of this, we think about our child well-being system as opposed to the child welfare agency. When you talk about child protection, you cannot do that in isolation. Our partners at SDE and across the educational spectrum, along with our behavioral health service provider partners, the healthcare industry, and the understanding that and partnerships that we have with law enforcement and other community stakeholders are all in this together. We're locking arms to try to help not only during the pandemic, but how we have built this system prior to the crisis that we are in to be stronger on the other side of it. And kids are navigating this at the same time, and the 600 or so people who are registered for this are doing this every day. You have been dedicated to the students of Connecticut for the last few months during unprecedented times. And, we know that when this is all over, you'll still be there. And so this conversation today is about ways that we can view our work across systems collectively better. What you'll also see in the chat at some point is a resource list of ways to contact folks at DCF to be a part of this conversation with you. If you have any questions, to problem solve and to work through concerns that you may have, so you're not just feeling like you're figuring it out on your own. We want to be as responsive and transparent as possible throughout all of this. So the contact information of my staff across all of our 14 area offices will be shared with you. You can contact anyone from DCF with the first name, last name at ct.gov. I'll also include in that frequently dialed numbers, local office telephone numbers. The program supervisors of investigations will be in that document that I'll share with you. And then you'll also see ways to request mandated reporter trainings to be able to have this conversation much longer than what we're having here today. And then also the ability to understand that sometimes some of our work with you, it requires us to have those discussions together. And so you will get that document as part of the information that we'll be sharing today. Next slide. And so one of the things that people have said to us is, well, how do we know what's happening to kids at home, right? How do we know if, we've been shuttered in place and, we don't know what's happening at home. And, I know if I'm logging in with the child who is at home during remote learning that, things are happening in the background, and I don't, how do we know if children are safe? And we've seen across the country that people have, said that, I'm really trying to see or notice if there's abuse or neglect. And I will tell you that in our conversations with our partners in healthcare, that there are pediatricians and specialists and child abuse docs who say, this is my profession, and there's no way for me to even be able to detect a bruise or a mark in a remote environment, because it's really difficult to be able to do that. What I challenge you to do is being able to understand child maltreatment in the context of the stress that families are under. Building a rapport and engaging with families is much more effective than trying to find things in the little square that you see on your screen. Or even with a child that's in front of you, it's important to understand that you have a trusting relationship to incorporate and foster connections. Check in regularly with the student's social emotional learning and their physical well-being by asking questions, trying to not create biases, but understand what you know about that child prior to today. What did you know prior to the crisis or prior to the pandemic? DCF works with families that are either in home and intact. We also work with families who are in foster care. And we also have worked with local school districts across the continuum. So it's, really trying to understand, is this behavior or is the environment or their affect the same as what we typically know? Or is there a general presentation that's a little bit different? Does the student have special needs or increased vulnerability that we have to tune into a little bit more? We've all seen the illustration by now on the equity and the kids at the fence. Are there kids that need a little bit more of our support? Does remote learning create a unique opportunity for those relationships to develop even further? What we're finding across DCF is that our staff and families are communicating differently because the power differential has changed. Understanding if we approach caregivers from a place of appreciative inquiry, they're more likely to engage with us and let us know if they're struggling. Try to develop relationships with caretakers to increase communication and assess beyond academics. I know I'm asking a lot of educators, and I'm saying that from a place of sincerity. I'm a teacher's kid, and I've said that before as we talk about our partnerships across academics. I know the sacrifices that educators make. And so in thinking about how we partner with SDE, it's how we partner with families as well. Is there an explanation for the concern that you might have that the student or the caregiver can offer you? Is it congruent from what you're asking the child about to what the caregiver is saying to you? Or are you making assumptions about things that we haven't connected the dots on? How does the student indicate that there's a concern that's going on for them? And how are you interpreting that information, and what are you doing with it? Are there resources that the child or family needs to be connected to beyond the school-based work? Are there other professionals in the community that either share your concern or that can help with the issues that a family might be facing? Next slide, please. In this remote environment, it's hard to assess what's happening with the child. And one of the things that are challenging our families across Connecticut is this balance of whether or not they can safely return to work. Do they have a job to return to? And then what happens to their children during the time that they may need to be away from home? One of the things we have to share with you just statutorily is that there is no age in Connecticut that a child cannot be left home alone. People are surprised by that because, you know, there's a concern that if a child is unsupervised, that they may be in danger, and that could be the case. But you also have to assess whether or not that child can identify an appropriate caregiver, a neighbor, a responsible sibling, or somebody else that can kind of help in a situation that might be an emergency or cause for concern. You also want to take into consideration that child's developmental level and access or proximity to resources and their level of comfort if they are indeed alone. But the act in and of itself of being at home alone is not in and of itself an issue within Connecticut. You know, I know that educators have reported kind of seeing things in the background, and you all have seen a lot in the remote environment. And so, yes, we are taking in what's happening, but we're also recognizing that, you know, in remote learning, you are in someone's home, and the prolonged nature of this pandemic has left us all just very, very vulnerable. Next slide, please. So, you know, as we collectively assess educational issues and needs within our families that we're working with, you can advance the slide, Kari. You want to understand what barriers could be creating that access concern for participation with either remote or in-person learning. Are there things that this parent or caregiver are directly responsible for or unwilling to resolve? Ask first before we assume that they can't or that they haven't tried to figure out what the situation is that's preventing the child from either logging on or being there in person. What efforts have been made by the district to identify those concerns or engage in solution-focused dialogue? Because again, remember, we started this conversation with really the desire to make sure that children are lifelong learners. Next slide. Of course, you know, we are here as the Child Protective Service Agency, and so I always have an opportunity to share our 800 number. It's 24/7. I have the director of our care line on, Lisa Damond, who can answer some of those questions as we get to that portion of the webinar. But I, you know, want you to recognize that sometimes DCF should be the last call and not the first. Families are struggling and are going through a lot just as we are, and to understand and help children become engaged and to be that lifelong learner really takes all of us. And it, you know, really asking those questions of whether or not this is something that we might be able to help this family through and what they're going through in this pandemic, as opposed to immediately contacting DCF to determine whether or not a child is safe. And of course, if there's a reasonable suspicion of abuse or neglect, the number is there. And then when we share the slide deck, the mandated reporter training specific to school employees is also embedded in this particular slide. You can go to the next slide. So it's always important to contextualize what we're talking about. And if you look at the bottom of the slide, the blue bar represents 2019 and the orange bar represents 2020. And we talk about the decrease in volume to our call center, to our care line social workers who accept calls from the community. And what you will see is that about 42% of the calls that came in last year came from schools. We're at about 34% at this particular time, so we're creeping up back to our average of what it looks like usually in 45 days post Labor Day. What you see above that is the general acceptance rate of the reports that come into our care line, and then above that, those two bars represent the school acceptance rate. And so we're about even with what we've been accepting from school personnel. Next slide. Now, when you look at data, you have to look at it in context. A lot of people are concerned about our decreased volume over the pandemic, but I'd like to tune you into this. So in 2019, about 67,500 reports were received by our care line. That's in the context of about 110 calls that they fielded. So those 67,000 reports that were taken, of those, 24,000 came from school personnel. And so 2019 reflected about a 12% increase in reports to our care line. And we know that some of that had to do with changes in our mandated reporter statutes and the emphasis on failure to report, and some really high profile cases as it relates to the failure of school personnel to contact DCF. So we know that that bump up occurred, and we did some level setting and calibrating before the pandemic to really get in and talk to local school districts about our relationships with each other. So of the reports that were received from school personnel, so I'm in that second bubble, about 36% were we're talking about the calls received from personnel. That's about 36% of what we received. The third bubble represents what got accepted. So of those reports that were received, 10,000 were accepted. And so that represents about 40%. So of that 40% that were accepted, about 4,200 were designated for investigation. Connecticut has a 2-track system. So we have family assessment response, and we have an investigation response. And so 42% of those were accepted for investigation, so about 4,000. And so the investigations actually result in a finding of whether they are unsubstantiated or substantiated. What you need to know in Connecticut is less than 10% of the reports that come from school personnel, so at about 6.5%, are actually substantiated. That means that they're confirmed. The substantiation rate in Connecticut for all of our reports, regardless of where they came from, is 37%. That's a stark difference. So if you think back to that original number of the reports that come from schools all the way down to what actually gets substantiated, there's a different story to tell. Next slide, please. That story was illuminated significantly in COVID. The department created, just like other agencies across the state, an online portal, and you can go to the DCF website. I've embedded the live link there to be able to get COVID information. And so when at the same time, our calls to our care line and our call center dramatically decreased because primarily the education professionals were not calling in reports as frequently as they had in the past, people were contacting us. Over 21,000 unique URLs were contacting DCF or logging onto our website to ask about things related to childcare, related to domestic violence, related to food insecurity, related to how do I get access to Wi-Fi, related to mental health and substance use disorders, related to housing concerns and income insecurity. All of those things were where people clicked around our website to be able to know, for us to know what families were actually going through. And if we, as a Child Protective Service agency, didn't pay attention to this stat, we would be running around really trying to drum up more calls to our call center. And that's not the case. We need to understand that families are struggling through the pandemic, but they are supporting their children and accessing services. And how do we make sure that that information on what resources are available can get connected to kids and families in a way that's compassionate and understanding of the struggles that everybody is experiencing through this pandemic. Next slide. And so some of the ways that educators can connect with students in a way that recognizes the fatigue of being in this prolonged state of crisis is that we need to engage with kids slowly. You know, understand that they're going through a lot, as we all are. Take a stance of not knowing and understand that children and their parents are experts in their own lives. Let's talk to them, hear what they're experiencing, asking questions, not from a place of accusation, but how are you getting through all of this? What can we do to help? Who can we connect you to? How can we, as the system, help individual families and individual students succeed? Listen more to what they're experiencing. Let's try to regulate ourselves, our own emotions. I know we're frustrated when we can't connect with the child or family. And when we finally do, sometimes it feels as though they're not trying. But I will tell you that nobody wants their child to not succeed. And I've been in this work close to 30 years, and I know that even in the most horrific situations, a parent wants their child to succeed. Stay compassionate and curious in your interventions and in your conversations, and really try to understand what families are experiencing during this time. Next slide. And so we wanted to know what it was like in our foster families. So Connecticut has just under 4,000 children in care. And we asked our foster families some questions about what their experiences were back in the springtime. And our foster parents were able to let us know that nearly all of them participated in distance learning in the springtime. The majority of caretakers reported feeling somewhat or extremely comfortable with their role of helping children navigate distance learning. A small percentage felt less comfortable and less equipped. About 95% of our respondents indicated that students had access to equipment and that was necessary for distance learning. A small number had packet information or paper instruction from their local districts and didn't have a need for equipment. The majority of students in our foster care system engaged in distance learning reported spending that 2 or more hours a day engaged either online or the packets or through teacher-led instruction. A small percentage did not participate or participated sporadically. And when we dug underneath that deeper, it was primarily barriers to the students' willingness to engage, or some of our older children that might have had some experiences with disengagement prior to the pandemic. Nearly all the students that are in foster care were promoted to the next grade, but those who did not, again, tended to be of high school age that may have been struggling prior to remote learning, and about 60% received a pass-fail or versus letter grades. The majority of the students that were using equipment either had their own or used the foster parents' equipment or were received from their individual districts. We again want to use this information to help us navigate if we have to shift again. And so many of you across the state have done an excellent job of balancing either in-person learning or remote learning with your students. Next slide. So again, other ways that educators and students can interact with each other. Those open-ended questions are always better than leading or guessing about what's happening or making assumptions. Invite curiosity and self-reflection. I'm experiencing some struggles. What are you doing? How are you coping? As you talk to your students, as you talk to their parents from a place of compassion. Notice when emotions are shifting quickly and regulate ourselves as to how we engage with kids and their families and their caregivers. Stay in the present moment and respond with compassion and acceptance because, again, families are experiencing a lot of turmoil during the pandemic. And when you make a mistake or when we as systems make a mistake, we have to acknowledge that and apologize to families. That goes a long way with helping to model that vulnerability that we expect them to give us, that courage and honesty that we are literally all in this together. Next slide. And this is also an opportunity to talk about ways in which the pandemic has illuminated those disparities. And we have the equity conversations of understanding that what we need to do as systems comes at that institutional level of things. It's an opportunity to adjust how we interact with those that we serve. We often expect them to change and adjust to the system. We need to be the ones to kind of level that playing field and understand that as we kind of think about person's, their own racial identity or their ethnic identity and how they've chosen or how they have been raised to cope with adversity, understand that we as institutions have a responsibility to look at our biases within our policies and practices that might be contributing to disparate outcomes or achievement gap issues. And so this pandemic has given us an opportunity to really think about ways in which we interact with students in a way that honors where they come from and honors what their families have been experiencing in the context of our communities. And then next slide. The last piece of information, again, just reinforces the message that I hope you've heard over the last few minutes that we've had to speak to each other. You can go to the next one, Kari. And that is, again, this notion of none of us being here alone, that we are all here to really try to make sure that children are successful in their learning and that their families are successful in navigating this crisis. And so, DCF is a part of the partnership that will continue to work with you and not fight you on understanding the needs of our kids and families. And they need us to be collective in our approach to that. So thank you for your time. And we are at this point turning this over to Deputy Commissioner Charlene Russell Tucker from Connecticut State Department of Education to take us through the next piece of our program.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you for all that really great information that you presented to us. And to remind all participants that you can put your questions in the question box, and we're having that monitored so we can come back to that. So moving forward in our presentation today, I'm very pleased again to be here with Hedy Chang, and Executive Director of Attendance Works, and a friend to Connecticut, longtime friend. I was checking the time frame today. We've been at this together, Hedy, for a decade, working on the issue of attendance. And Hedy has helped us over the years to really make a dent in our numbers for chronic absence. And we're truly grateful for that. And we're still at it now in this new pre-COVID world. Pre and post, I guess we're still in it to address issues of attendance and engagement. So Hedy, you've been sought after, and there's not many articles that you can read about attendance now without seeing Attendance Works have you quoted there. And so I know you bring a national perspective to the work that we're doing. So we'll go through a few questions, like 3 things that we really want to talk about with you. Why should we care about attendance and absenteeism at this point in time?
Great, thank you. And let's go to the next slide. You know, I want to offer this next slide because I think it helps us think about both pre-COVID and current COVID, but which is we've used attendance for multiple purposes. Some of it has been to allocate funding, right? Because attendance gives a sense of how many kids are there and how much resources you might need. A lot of it has been ensuring compliance with compulsory ed. I think that was how I first got involved with Connecticut, when you all were trying to figure out your excused versus unexcused absences. And it's when we think about at what point do you invoke the legal system to help to enforce. And then we've also thought about accountability, which attendance is now in Connecticut, as well as 36 other places, an accountability measure under ESSA. I actually want to propose that those 3 measures on the left-hand side have been important, and right now we got to hold off on them. We need to hold schools harmless because we got to support our schools as much as they can so they can ramp up and meet this pandemic, which is more costly than anything we could have ever imagined. How do you do all the work that you're doing? We actually, at this moment, and I think this is very much in keeping with Commissioner Dorantes' comments, this is not, what we know is kids are going through huge trauma. The response to trauma is not what's wrong with you, but how can I help you? When you threaten people with court, with the legal system, you are so saying what is wrong with you. And that's not the way to engage and support families, especially now during a pandemic. So we got to create alternatives to legal action. And right now, while I think we're thinking through accountability, there is so much variation going on in what is attendance. It's hard to have consistent data, even though I think Connecticut is better than most in creating this. We got to just really think about these 2 measures on the right-hand side. We need attendance for early warning so we know if they're not showing up, who needs help. And we need attendance to support better program and policy decisions, because the first indication that we're not reaching or connecting or engaging kids is when they don't show up at all, or they only show up infrequently, which is what chronic absence is a measure of. And I'll talk more about, we'll get to the how you do it, about some of the ways you can do that. So the next slide, I just want to offer up that this is about the fact that absenteeism is a leading indicator and a cause of educational inequity. It is a leading indicator because we'll know this before we see any other metrics around assessments or academic performance. And when kids, assuming we're still offering something useful in schools, when kids miss out, it means they fall behind. Next slide. What we've been thinking about is how do we frame this? And in a way, this is a visual that we actually created with David Osher over at AIR prior to the pandemic, but I think it still holds true. And again, I think it, I think we were practicing together, Commissioner Dorantes, even before, without having known what exactly we were going to say. But kids come to school when they feel physically and emotionally healthy and safe. We closed schools because we said we're going to keep you physically safe. As we reopen schools, or we reopen schools in distance, we have to figure out how they are physically, emotionally healthy and safe. And now school isn't just what's in the school building. School's what's taking place at home while you're in distance learning. So that means more than ever before, you need an interdepartmental, cross-disciplinary approach to making sure that kids feel physically, emotionally safe. And then they have to feel a sense of belonging, connection, and support to the educators who are in schools. And I think that's why that advice that Commissioner Dorantes offered to educators about how they take on a relational approach, how you show vulnerability, how you don't make assumptions, you ask questions. That's what makes someone feel connected and supported. It's not because you're perfect. It's because you feel, or the other person's perfect. It's because you feel the other person understands you and wants to help you. And then we still have to look at academic challenge and engagement. And how do we have adults and students who support this? And this has to happen whether classes are in person, at a distance, or blended. And attendance, or the lack thereof, is the first sign that some of this isn't in place, and it means that we have to investigate, develop those relationships, because it's only through relationships that we can actually understand what's missing and how we can put it in place.
So that's great, Hedy. And you started to talk about, so then what do we do? Right, so that's the question I know people are on and have tried many strategies, but can you maybe lift up some really important things that we can do right now in this new space to improve attendance?
Yeah, let's go to the next slide. And the first thing I want to say, which is a relief, is this is not all about doing things new. We have things. You have worked so hard as a state to put in place tiered supports. What you want to do is strengthen, bolster that, and adapt them to a new reality. And one thing I will say is this image, which you can read about more on our website, also has another layer of tier that's on the foundational supports below. And let me explain that, because that's a new concept. Next slide. It actually also means it's even more important to have interagency, cross-departmental partnerships again to put this in place. Foundational supports are the building blocks of good schools that promote attendance. Having a physically healthy learning environment, having access to learning supports for special ed and ELL, those are things that maybe we always knew, but now the COVID has added new aspects. Having access to tech equipment and connectivity. A year ago, we would not have probably said that was a foundational support. Now it is. And that's why you as a state have so invested in this. And we have to continue to invest in it. Although I will say, it by itself is not a foundational support. It is one of the building blocks of a foundational support. Having supports for families facilitating learning at home. Having a welcoming, socially, emotionally, trauma-informed climate, which again connects to the comments of the commissioner early on. One of the things I also think that this becomes connected to is, it used to be that making sure kids knew when class was held just was a matter of telling them what the first day of school was. And then we all went into the routine. That's how I get to school. This way. We have a whole new ballgame now. What is school? If it's distance, if it's blended, when am I supposed to show up? Where do I show up? How do I show up? Kids and families can't show up unless they know where, when, and how they were supposed to show up. And now that is not a given. So we have to invest now in these foundational supports along with the tiers. Next slide. And we also have to tweak our tiers so that they work in distance. So mentoring, for example, which again, Connecticut has been fabulous. And I think, Charlene, you all have been investing in virtual e-mentoring. You're going to have to do it in a different way. Mentoring still works, but you're going to have to pivot to a new environment. Home visits still work, but you're going to have to figure out how to do this either socially distanced or through virtual means. These are still possible, but we got to get creative about how we do it. Next slide. I also want to offer up, we're going to have to think about how do we use new metrics to identify when you activate these supports. And in Commissioner Cardona, I so appreciate his leadership and his comments. He kept emphasizing the use of data for prevention, and that That's key. We have to continue to using data. So there's the universal work, which is for everyone. Then there's the tier 2. And this is where I'm really worried that we are going to only focus on the intensive, we're going to miss the opportunity to make sure that we're noticing the kids who are just missing 10% of learning opportunities, so that we can activate those tier 2 prevention, less expensive prevention, early interventions. And each school and each district is going to have to think about how do they almost adapt their tiered supports, which I think most have been starting to put in place because you guys have been at it for a while in Connecticut, but they have to think about what are the tweaks to trigger supports, and then make sure. So the other thing that's changing about this is teachers are more at the front lines than ever before, right? Because sometimes in distance learning, they're the only ones in contact with families. So if that's the case, you have to have both a trigger for when did the teacher notice, but how can they hand off to someone else in the school or community environment who can support them, because this cannot be all on the backs of teachers. They have so much to do. We need to make sure that we are activating supports, and there are clear clues about how and when you can activate the extra supports that will make this possible.
Well, thank you, Hedy, and thanks for the opportunity to share. I think it was a week or so ago we did, with the Governor's Prevention Partnership, we did another webinar on virtual mentoring. And so I'm sure that is posted as well for participants that can go and take a look at that. So my final question, Hedy, is then how can we use data, and you started to talk a bit about that, to identify who needs support?
So let's go to the next slide. I actually think we have to think about lack of opportunity to learn and a bit more broadly. So one is contact information. If we can't reach families, it's sort of, there's not much you can do. And we have to track how many families have we lost contact with, and how do we make sure that we don't? And that's not just a beginning of the year thing now. That's an ongoing year, because one of the consequences of the pandemic is kids and families are moving all over the place to find a safe place that they can be. And that may not be in the same place, but we need to still find them and either keep them in distance learning and connected to school because that's where they're connected, or make sure they get connected to the school district that can help them. We have to continue to monitor what's happening around connectivity. And what I'm hearing from school districts across the country is people did this huge effort in the spring, and then stuff happens. You know, we all experience how stuff happens to our technology and our connectivity. It worked last week, it stopped working this week. I can't figure out how to get online. And it may not be a complicated solution, but we want to do that quickly before the kids lose out on the learning time. And then we have to look at prior chronic absence. If you knew a kid was chronically absent prior to COVID, you know that they are seriously at risk. You want to actually add more supports. And if they're starting to miss 10% or more, that adds them to the list. And what I would say, though, is we also all constantly want to monitor. What are we putting in place to build positive relationships? Because if we can sustain those relationships, then one of those things happen. When one of those things happens, we have a way to reach them and figure it out. If we have no connections with families, if they don't trust us, you can't resolve any of these other issues. And when we can do all of these things, we can improve learning time. When we can't, we lose out on learning time and opportunities. Next slide. So just to add to that, we're adding in these new sort of ways of looking at it beyond chronic absence, which I know that Connecticut has been adapting in. We're adding in working contact, we're adding in connectivity, we're adding measuring and really making sure we're creating those reciprocal supportive relationships to families, and we're looking at the extent to which kids show up and complete learning activities in multiple modes of, I would say you want to look at within and across modes of instruction, ideally. Within, whether it's blended, you know, is it your in-person, is it your distance, is it your asynchronous learning? Because part of what's happening, if you can know that data across modes, you can better problem solve. Actually, go to the next slide, please, Kari. We see, again, is that you're going to have to use your data. And this is, again, Connecticut has always been so data-driven. That will serve you well here. We need to look at these measures by school, by grade, by race, ethnicity, home language, disability. Kids in special ed have been really affected in so many challenging ways by zip code. We need to look at by mode of instruction. And then you need to combine this quantitative information. So if I notice this group is disproportionately affected, then you have to talk to the kids' families, also educators, to find out what's happening. It's not, the quantitative information will not give us the whole story. It's our conversations that will help us then understand how we address unequal access to resources. And next slide. And what I would also say is that those of you on the call, take a hard look at your first month of school data. We really need to look at this hard, and we also, as we look at it, have to understand how is our definitions of attendance affecting, because we have gone from when attendance was kind of equally understood. It was Charlene in front of me in class, and then Charlene got to be counted as there. We are now offering, and I appreciate, and I know Ajit will talk more about what that definition is, but we're going to have to understand how that's affecting our data. I will say though, if I know that Charlene isn't showing up consistently or Charlene's not showing up at all, whatever the measure of showing up is, doesn't matter. The fact that you're not there means I need to offer additional support to you. So I can use that to activate early supports. I would also encourage, and I know that this is something that the department has already been emphasizing, but we still need to take daily attendance. Frequent, even more sometimes is even helpful. The more we notice, the more we're able to have timely information to be able to take action.
All right. Thank you so much, Hedy, for addressing those 3 questions. I know that we've got other questions in the chat, but before we go to that, I'm just going to turn things over to Ajit Gopalakrishnan to follow on really nicely, just to talk a little bit about the data.
Thank you, Charlene. Thank you, Hedy. Thank you, commissioners, for setting this up. You can go to the next slide. Thank you, Kari, for navigating this. You know, when the commissioner was talking about, and he started off with the connection between the why, the how, and the what. And it is extremely important for that through line to be really strong and tight. So a good what is designed if you have a deep understanding of the why. And when you don't have an understanding of the why, the what can get out of sync. And I think in Connecticut, we've done a great job of connecting, designing the right what's, if you will, to measure and report so that we can incent and encourage the right actions from adults and students and families that actually support and reinforce the why. Because I think that through line is really important. And it seems that with this pandemic, the same thing is happening, because we now have education that is provided entirely remotely, whether it be because the district is remote for health reasons or because the family is opting to be fully remote for health reasons, personal reasons, or other concerns. So in that case, the department needed to create this new guidance for tracking attendance on remote days. And so, you know, when we went emergency remote in March, in mid-March, when we suddenly became fully remote, we did not have this guidance because there was no concept of a remote school day, if you will. So when in developing this guidance, we consulted with our districts and our practitioners and folks who work with students every day. We also consulted with other states and national experts like Hedy and others to sort of get our sense of what this guidance should be. Most important thing is that we started with our definition of what it means to be in attendance. And that is on the top of that slide, and the link to this handout is in the bottom. And if Matt could post that in the chat, you can have access to this link as well. And it's referenced in our addendum 14 guidance around attendance as well. This is one of the documents we reference. So our definition of attendance in Connecticut is that the student is present at his or her assigned school or an activity sponsored by the school for at least half of the regular school day. And that's important because it says that it's not just the kid showing up for one class or just being there for 10 minutes, that the kid has to be in school for at least half the school day. That was the existing definition of attendance that was actually crafted by the state board in 2008. So when we were looking at this remote attendance concept, we basically said, you know what, it can't be any different from that. We have to start with that baseline expectation, even on a remote day, that students will be there for at least half the day. That's the minimum standard. But obviously how students demonstrate that they're there for a half a day could vary. So the flexibility, the adaptability of how we track this attendance became important, the what, so that we can reinforce the why. In this case, we want students engaged. We want students connected. When schools are opening in so many different ways and parents have these choices, we want our what of attendance to be connected to that why. So on a remote day, a student could show their presence in many ways through synchronous virtual classes. So if it's real-time virtual classes that are done, and this may be even for a hybrid student on a remote day. You know, many of our districts are operating in a hybrid format where some students, where half the school might come in on Monday, Tuesday, and the other half comes in on Thursday, Friday, and Wednesday is an entirely remote deep cleaning day type situation. We have those types of formats. So this would apply for the hybrid student on the remote day as well. So they could be part of synchronous virtual classes. They could be part of meetings that they might have with a teacher or a counselor. They might also show their presence, a student, through electronic systems, through activities and logs in electronic systems. And lastly, in more asynchronous ways, through completing assignments or submitting assignments through systems like Google Classroom or Microsoft Classroom or whatever your district uses. So we basically crafted the system, and we said, you know, or this guidance, and we said, you know, if these together add up to at least half a day, then a remote student could be deemed present. So that was kind of the new guidance that we had to create. And more recently, based on the implementation of this guidance and the questions we have received from districts, and Corey, you can go to the next slide here. We have actually added to this one pager to put out some additional frequently asked questions. Again, clearly this is not meant to be a slide, more of a reference to the handout, but we had to clarify questions like, if the school has is offering virtual synchronous classes, does a student need to be present in those virtual synchronous classes to be deemed in attendance? What if the student couldn't be there for whatever personal reason or situation, but they get their work done after hours? Does that, could that count as attendance? And the short answer here is that the state does not require that the student must be present in that synchronous virtual class if they can show that they can complete their work for that particular class on that particular day. Remember, this is still a daily attendance construct. And another sort of question that we received is, you know, there are cases where a student couldn't get their work done between 8:30 and 5, but they were able to, with the help of the family member, complete the assignments or work after school hours, if you will. So if you were to take attendance for that student at 5 o'clock in the evening, you might not have seen the student's work yet. And you see the student's work, if you were to go the next morning and check, the student would have submitted their work. So we're adding clarifying guidance here to say that, you know, it's our strong recommendation is that attendance for remote days for those students be actually taken the next day, not at 5 p.m. on the same day, just to give that kid a chance to finish their work. There's also a question here, the last one talks about situations where a student has an in-person day, they're supposed to come in, but for some legitimate reason, they are not able to come in. It could be a case and they have to be remote. I mean, the most common example might be that they're quarantining now for 2 weeks. So they're an in-person student, but they're now quarantining for 2 weeks. We do not want that student disengaged from school. We don't want that student to be treated as absent either if the student can access the instruction remotely and demonstrate that they're on each of those days doing at least half a day, if you will. So again, these are ways in which we are adapting the policies that we give out for, what on the face of it may seem like a simple thing, taking attendance. But when you add this construct of a remote day, it does make this complex. I have to applaud our school districts because we are now collecting data from school districts at the student level that is going to tell us, not at the end of the year, like we normally do with attendance, right? And to Hedy's point about continuous improvement and more proactive actions, we are actually collecting attendance on a monthly basis. So at the end of a month, we will start saying, okay, please send us attendance for that month. And not just total attendance. Starting with the October attendance, we're going to be getting data on how kids are attending on in-person days and how kids are attending on remote days. And that separation is big because it'll allow us to see how students are attendance differs if school is in person for them or if school is remote. Now, I just want to acknowledge this is a big lift for our students, and we appreciate all the work that districts are doing, because the way we take attendance has also changed with this pandemic. So, and there's a lot of work that our districts and our educators are doing to actually take attendance for both our in-person students, but also our remote students. So I just want to appreciate the work that our districts are doing. So Charlene, I hope that at least captures this guidance and emphasizes the key points. If there's anything I've missed, please let me know, and I'm happy to speak to that.
Certainly. Thank you so much, Ajit. And I know we have about 25 minutes left. We want to dedicate that to questions. Questions have been coming in, but just really want to thank our three lead presenters here today for putting this together. And John, we're going to turn things over to you so you can start fielding the questions for our panelists.
Okay, terrific. I want to honor the questions that came in early. So the first question actually is for Commissioner Dorantes. So I'm going to ask Kari if you could jump to slide 13 for a moment. Commissioner, in your presentation, you talked certainly a lot about partnerships, state level partnerships, and all of the partners that are necessary to support students. There was a question in the chat about the role of families, and I know the role of families is certainly an important part of all of your work. And so when you look at this slide, can you just talk a little bit about the DCF's vision for the role of families in this continuum of a child well-being system?
Absolutely, and I would also ask Deputy Commissioner Michael Williams to chime in on that, because the role of families is critical here, so that other community stakeholders, to me, encapsulates families. Everything that we do is from that system's perspective of the child being in the center, and then their family and community supporting that child's success. So, and you're right, I probably should update the visual to state that explicitly, but in my mind, the community stakeholders involve the family and that particular child. Michael?
Yeah, sure, and good afternoon, everyone. In all that we do, we acknowledge the fact that children live in families and families live in communities, and we cannot do our work by isolating children from their families or their families from their communities and try to do interventions solely with a child. Those interventions have to strengthen the family unit of where children live, and have to strengthen the communities where families live. And if we can't see our work connected to that kind of continuum, then we will never improve the lives of children at the level that they should and deserve to be improved. And it starts with our ability to look at families differently. And this pandemic has brought it home more clearly for us now than ever before, as we look at, racial unrest, economic turmoil, that families are resilient, families are strong. Unfortunately, we look at them with a lens of deficit rather than with the lens of strength. That's the greatest asset in our work, the family unit. And we have to figure out a way to move away from a system that is built on surveillance and gotcha to a system that's built on support and giving families what they need. Because once families and parents are in the driver's seat, which they always are, but we just muscle the steering wheel away from them. But once we let them drive and we give them all that they need, the fuel in the car, GPS systems and everything else, they will get there. It's a matter of us understanding the power that exists in the family unit.
Thank you, Commissioner. So speaking of, the needs for both the additional needs of families, but also the volume of families and the volume of students that are needing support now compared to, when pre-COVID days. So Hedy, this is really a question for you, and the question comes from Alden, and he asks, we are really struggling with the volume of students that we need to support as an attendance team, 3 times what we are used to. Do you have any strategies or suggestions for how to be more efficient as a team to facilitate addressing this and many more families in need of support?
Yeah, and I want to suggest that it relates to that tiered support system. So Kari, I don't know if you were able to move that. We have to have a bigger vision of who's on the team. And then we have to be thoughtful about how do we allocate out responsibilities. I think that it has always been critical to, so if you, 33, Kari, that foundational and tier 1 supports are what prevent kids from ending up in tier 2 and tier 3. And those have to have a whole school and a whole community. So for example, if you, and I see schools, for example, forgetting that they really could be leveraging their after school supports. That could be part of your team. They could be helping to create relationships. They could be supporting both your tier 1 and tier 2. The issue is we too narrowly define the team, and then the size of the problem overcomes the team. If we broaden who's in the team and get clear, and they're not part of every attendance team meeting, but maybe you have a representative, or maybe you're going to them and saying, hey, here's the part of either foundational tier 1 or tier 2 that we need help with. How can you help be part of our team? Even if you don't want to make sure that everyone has to show up to every single meeting, though I will admit, one of the benefits of moving to Zoom meetings, it is a lot easier to have meetings and conversations with people when we've just now reduced all the transportation, traffic time, whatever, and we just put people in conversation. So I'd say that teams are even more important. Think more broadly about who could be on the team, and then clarify who is responsible for what aspects. And then the other part is really truly using your data so you can, and you might have to prioritize. You may have to look at it and say, which part of this I can tackle first, and how do I slowly move through what's most essential.
And I can see the commissioners may want to jump in on this,
Yeah.
Because there's the education piece, but I wonder if this is not also the opportunity, Commissioner Dorantes, of thinking about, as Hedy talked about, the expansion of the team. Are there new ways to look at our partnership, our local partnerships, and what could that look like? So Commissioner Cardona and Dorantes, I'm sure you want to jump in here.
Sure. I'm going to give the mic first to Commissioner Vannessa Dorantes, and I'll definitely jump in.
Yeah, so when we think about collectively prevention in the field of child welfare, it has always been viewed in the absence of safety. And we know now today that that couldn't be more wrong. When we think about prevention and those upstream efforts, the collections on a local level, the connections to people with lived experience to the previous question, and having everybody around the table, but not just there in name only. You can't invite people to the table and not allow them to eat. How do you use the people that are in your communities to help drive that community need? So I think those local connections are key here to really honing in on the families that need the most support.
Yeah, and I'd like to add, when we talk about attendance teams, and when I was a principal, I remember having an attendance team that we really looked at the school-wide data, and then at the district level, we had an attendance team that was looking at the district data. The game has changed. We need to restructure. And I love this slide below where tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Attendance and connectivity and engagement, it's totally different now. We're in a pandemic. So if we think that we're going to use the same systems that we used prior to the pandemic to address this issue, we're going to be banging our head against the wall, right? So, you know, if we do what we've done, we're going to get what we've gotten. So I'm encouraging everyone to really rethink their organization, rethink their school, rethink their district. Everyone's hands have to be on this. It's the same way I feel about ELs, English learners. Everyone's an EL teacher. So how are we building capacity at the tier 1 level where everyone has a role here, because this is such a significant need? I'll make it analogous to the State Department of Education. 7 months ago, we didn't spend as much time talking about health metrics. We didn't spend much time talking about indicators, local indicators. We've had to become more proficient in it, and we've had to reorganize our time and our organizational talent and the resources that we have, not new resources, but the current resources, to make sure that we're evolving to meet the need. Right now, what we're finding is engagement and attendance is the primary need. So how are organizations, how are districts, how are schools rethinking and saying we cannot do it the way we've done it? We have to shift to make sure that all hands on deck and that there are very clear outcomes at every level of the organization. So teacher outcomes, parent, principal, district level folks, superintendent, how are we reporting the data? I think those are conversations that I would strongly encourage the attendance team to lead, because you have the best understanding of it. So rethink how you're looking at it from an organizational perspective so that you can be most effective.
And I also think, Commissioner, who are your natural community partners? You know, Commissioner Naismith and myself yesterday was on the phone with some folks who really want to connect with a particular district because their resources, sometimes simple messaging, you know, getting messages out to families, their community partners there. All right, John, what else? Thank you.
So there's a question in the chat that's sort of been answered already, but I just want to call attention to it. And it's from a mental health provider, and is asking, when a student is not engaged in either in-person or remote learning, they've already gone through tier 3 intensive interventions and they're having troubles. I think the conversation around engaging community partners is critical in that stage. I want to remind folks that through youth service bureaus, the state has a system of youth service bureaus that are there to support school districts for kids who are, we still use the word truant, but we're just talking about kids who are not engaged. So there's a process for you to refer families to youth service bureaus, or they cover, you know, over 150 communities in the state. So find your community partners. In addition, you know, DCF manages those youth service bureaus, and they're an excellent resource in your community as well.
John, this is Hedy. I also wondered whether Connecticut has been exploring. I've been starting to see new proposals about how we actually leverage young people themselves in this process. So, for example, if you were in a high school, and some kids actually are fine in this environment, or they you know, actually, arguably, our young people are probably a little more savvy on the tech side of it than many of us older folks. The digital natives are just a little. But could you, for example, you get credit, work study credit, if you're actually a support to other young people, if you're helping to engage young people, or there's you know, proposals about how we could recreate AmeriCorps with using AmeriCorps and the, you know, our near peers. And I wonder about how we could also be expanding who's involved by engaging both young people and families themselves in much more peer supports, because I think sometimes they are actually better able to understand what's the way you reach kids who are disengaged or families who are disengaged, and can do it in less of they're less likely to be seen as threatening when they're the support. So I wonder, has that been a conversation in Connecticut? Is that a possibility?
I couldn't unmute fast enough. It's great. You know, you bring up something that I think maybe hasn't been as explicitly discussed as student voice. Are we engaging our learners, or are they just receiving whatever we give them, right? Or are they? Is their voice being taken into account not only in what's disengaging them, but how to best solve these challenges that we're facing together? So I know districts have done exceptional work engaging student voice in a more meaningful way. And I think your suggestion is a good one. How do we turn this work how do we improve this work by engaging students in being part of the problem-solving team? I love that.
And I also know, I see, Commissioner, and someone commented that they appreciated the data about the parents, the reporting that you've done, and how can that information be more readily available so folks have a sense of kind of the scope of the issues there, and that be more mainstream so people can understand it.
Shalini, are you referencing the data that 40% of those reports that come from schools, and then less than that 6% that actually get substantiated? We're thinking about ways that we can use dashboards to have public-facing information, and I can't emphasize more those local connections to your local DCF offices to talk about ways in which you really understand child maltreatment, because when you go further upstream in the prevention arena, you really do sharpen your safety focus, because you're allowing for those connections to be made more innately and more, and people to talk to you about what's happening. When we are viewed as this threat that DCF is going to come, it's more likely to have people shut down. So, recognizing that there's a story here when you understand what the data and the metrics are telling us.
Thank you very much on that. And Akari, I know you're behind the scenes, but someone was asking about the virtual mentoring webinar, and I don't know if we've got that posted yet.
Hi, Charlene. The virtual mentoring webinar is being edited right now to be posted very shortly, probably early next week. And we'll share that with everyone who's registered for this event, along with slides.
So, Commissioner Dorantes, there are a couple of questions in the question box, and we get a lot of questions about when is it appropriate to contact DCF. And so I know under your leadership, you've really developed a more proactive, more supportive agency rather than called the DCF at the last minute. So with kids who are remote learning, some kids are logging on. They're they have their cameras off. There are a lot of questions in the chat about, hey, the kid logs on, but their camera's off. I'm not sure if they're engaged, or they don't log on for days at a time. So what's some guidance for districts to really sort of figure out, is there a concern for the child's welfare, or is this just necessary to provide some more supports to engage the families?
Yeah, I'm going to ask our Caroline director, Lisa Damon, to log on, because she can, unmute, because she can also talk about the scope of what comes in centrally to the Caroline, and what are some of the things that she has heard from her screeners as to some of the questions that have been coming in from the districts that get to your point, John.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm really excited to be participating today. Really the biggest thing to do is really engage with the parent, right? Engage with the child, find out what's going on. There could be a whole host of things, letting the parent know, hey, your child hasn't been logging on, or is there something going on at home? Is there an issue with the computer, the internet? Who knows? It's really trying to establish relationships, build rapport, and really get to know what's happening in that student's life, right? And those are the things that we would be wanting to see, like, what are the efforts? So before a call comes into the Caroline, what are some of the things that the school has done to engage the family, to figure out sort of what's happening? They have some concerns. We look at, if you look at like educational neglect, how old is the child? Is the child older and can access the system on his own? Is it a truancy issue? Is a child under 12 and maybe you've tried to reach the parent and talk to the parent, or you've talked to the parent and maybe things haven't improved. So there are a lot of things to really assess. It's really about trying to make sure before it comes to us that we're really trying to engage with the parent, assess what's happening. it's really hard out there. This COVID thing has really, impacted all of us in many different ways, right? From losing your jobs to losing family members. There's so much stress, and you don't really know what's happening until we start to really build that rapport and that relationship with that family. I would say that's first and foremost before calling in a report. Oftentimes I hear, we're being asked to investigate, and it's not about we're asking you to investigate. We're asking you to assess, to gather some additional information. And when you're calling in a report to the care line, that you are providing as much detail as possible for us to make a decision on whether we should be accepting that report. The other thing I want to really impress upon everybody is I know the biggest complaint is wait time. And although volume is down, our busy time has sort of shifted, and we are pretty busy. We're also getting a lot of reports that could be done online. So I want to encourage all of you to really file an online report that is been posted on I believe SDE site. It's not posted publicly because right now the online reporting portal is for schools, family relations, Office of Early Childhood, and our birthing hospitals. So yep. So I want to make sure that I really strongly encourage you, if it's a non-emergent situation, file a report online. Commissioner Dorantes has also talked about with everybody, it's really establishing that relationship with the area offices and really having those connections to bounce things off of and talk to people. It's really important that we're there and we can help answer questions. I'm always available. I think in one of Commissioner's things that we're going to post with employee information, I believe my number will be on there, as well as my email address. So I want to encourage everybody, like, we can have conversations about some concerns that you might be having about whether a report should be made and what other things you can be doing to engage a family. So I really want to encourage that. It's really, this collaboration is so important. And that we partner and that we, try to get to know and engage our families through this. That's the best way that I think we can handle and think about when a report should be made to the care line.
And John, if I could just add a little more to Lisa's comments, and that is to really stress that what it means to make a report to us, that there is a suspicion that one has that a child or children in your presence is being abused physically, emotionally, or sexually, or neglected at the hands of another person, mostly an adult. That suspicion is what drives the need to make the report. And I think sometimes, and we created an environment now, the failure to report has consequences that has driven folks to believe that they have to make reports on everything beyond just a suspicion of abuse and neglect. And so when you saw the data about the number of calls we get from school personnel around a case that don't get accepted, is because it doesn't rise to that level of, well, there's no abuse and neglect here. It's a report being made for the sake of making a report because there may be a potential or a connection to a failure to report, and therefore I may have a consequence that I don't want to suffer. So we have a lot of work to do on our end related to that, but I just think at the heart of this, what needs to be reported is that belief that a child or children that you're seeing are being abused or neglected by someone.
Thank you, Michael, for bringing that up, and I appreciate you acknowledging that. And in my efforts to learn more about the processes, I've seen in the last year efforts made by the Department of Children and Families to really provide more support and even look at how the folks that are working with schools, having that be a smaller group of folks that do that. And I think the efforts that you've taken to this point are moving us in the right direction. So I appreciate the acknowledgement and the work that you're doing at your agency on that.
And Hedy, I did see your hand up.
I just wanted to offer up, I think there's and I think this is what Deputy Commissioner was saying, is if a kid can't get online, that's not a basis for a suspicion of abuse. You know, that's because a kid may have challenges. And I guess there's a ruling out that I would wonder if you could explain. I'm thinking about the work that Todd Rogers actually did with LA Unified, where they were able to reduce absences. And it was a more automated approach. You know, Todd's a professor at Harvard who Charlene and the Connecticut Department of Ed have brought in before. But what they did in LA was they found they could reduce the absences. If after the absence occurred, they went back to the family and told them, this is when the absences happened. This is actually your kid's schedule. This is how your kid should have logged on. And here's a number you can call if you have questions. Because what you're trying to rule out is that the family didn't know when the kid was actually supposed to be in school, or didn't know how they were supposed to be in school, or didn't know who they could talk to get them in school. Because those aren't suspicion of child abuse. Those are families struggling with how to get their kids to school. And it seems to me there could be easy ways, and that also might answer the first question you had for us, John. How do we make sure you're not overwhelmed? We have to figure out how to get the easy, less hard issues to resolve out of the pipeline so we can use the more personalized attention for the kids who have real challenges that need a more personalized intervention.
Thank you very much, Hedy. I also know that there was a question that was asked, Jit, back to the FAQ and about subjects, and did it matter what subject students were participating in?
Thanks, Charlene. Yeah, I think that's an interesting question that we'll have to sort of discuss more internally in terms of aligning the mechanisms that districts have to take attendance with our expectation of half a day of being in school, especially if you can imagine a situation in a middle or high school where there are 7 classes or 5 classes that a student is taking. And if they're only, quote, present in one class, then does that count as meeting the half a day threshold? So it's I don't want to make a pat answer at this point. I want to kind of revisit it with our folks internally, and we will get back to that particular question. But it raises an interesting challenge in a remote environment.
And I think it shows that we're continuing to evolve as we learn more. And that's the purpose of the FAQs as we continue to go forward. So your questions here certainly informing us as we continue to work through this process. So thank you very much for that. You know, I'm reminded, I had another conversation yesterday and heard of a situation where one class got canceled and the student just thought I was done for the day, right? Didn't have to go back in because that was school. So there's so much that we're learning in you know, trying to demystify this new way of learning. John?
So we're just about up on time, but I want to remind folks of some resources that are up on our website. Addendum 14 from the Adapt, Advance, and Achieve document is up on our website, and embedded in that, it talks all about attendance and chronic absenteeism, but embedded in that document are a number of links. And one of the critical links in that is our link to our family engagement framework. So I know there are a lot of questions in the chat about struggling with engaging families. And so please take a look at that, and that can provide some guidance on engaging families as well. I don't know if we wanted to take more questions. We're about 1 minute over time. And we can defer to our commissioners if they want some final words.
Final words from our lead panelists.
Thank you. I just want to, close out by saying that what we're doing now is critically important, that we have these conversations, that we continue to listen to the field, listen to our teachers, listen to our principals, our district leaders, and our community partners, our families, and most importantly, our students. This is unprecedented, but we are able to try to develop those new strategies. As difficult as it might be, let's remember, we're sharing the same why, right? We want to make sure that we're giving kids in Connecticut the best opportunity for success. And it's going to require some changes because we're in unusual times. But we're going to remain committed to this work. And while we're appreciative of your work, of your ability to be here with us today, we're more appreciative of the work you're doing day in and day out to help our students in Connecticut. So thank you.
Thank you. We'll have final words. Yeah.
Sorry, Darlene.
No, I'm just going to say final words from you and Hedy as well.
Well, again, thank you for not only inviting us today, but for your ongoing partnership with us. And thank you to the districts represented on here because, you know, not just in crisis are we partnered. You know, as my role within this department is relatively new as commissioner, but as a practitioner and as a social worker over the years, one of our strongest partners has always been the local school districts that are represented across our 14 area offices. And so again, I would just encourage that local collaboration, those local connections, those ways that we can collectively figure this out. And, you know, one of the things you heard from us as we shared our data is that the call volume sometimes doesn't reflect the actual situations that are occurring that warranted a substantiation of child maltreatment. So we can do something different. What I heard Commissioner Cardona talk about was thinking about what this pandemic has illuminated for us to build back a better Connecticut for the kids and families that we serve. Compassion goes a long way and partners share power. So, you know, we have to see and view our families from this strength-based way. And we have to recognize that, you know, kids need people to be excited about their success, and they can read when people have already dismissed that they can't or won't. And that same goes for their parents. So the support of kids starts with the support of the families and communities that they come from.
Thank you, Commissioner. Hedy?
I would just end with saying, one, it is such a privilege and an opportunity to partner with Connecticut. You all had so much already in place, this data-driven continuous improvement approach, commitment to collaboration across agencies, a deep commitment to equity and equal opportunity for our young people. Those stood you well pre-COVID. Those same attributes are why you can pull together today's webinar. And what is so helpful is, I think, your ongoing commitment to learning. None of us can get this right because none of us predicted exactly how this would, no one knew this was going to happen or how this would occur. But I also do believe that this pandemic will allow us to learn ways of using technology and interagency collaboration that will lay a foundation for better work in the future to ensure every kid has an equal opportunity to learn. I so thank that Connecticut, all of you here, for all that you do. And everyone on the webinar as well, because this takes leadership at every level.
Thank you. And thank you for the team here that put this together. Be safe and be well. Thank you.